When Olivia Hayes, a no-nonsense attorney, boards her flight, she expects a few quiet hours to strategize her next big case. But her attention is drawn to Miles Carter, a reserved cardiac surgeon seated nearby. What begins as subtle suspicion fueled by recent societal fears spirals into paranoia, setting off a chain of tense confrontations in the confines of the airplane cabin. As Olivia's accusations escalate, Miles's calm demeanor and purpose for the trip unravel a narrative far different from what Olivia imagined, forcing her, and everyone watching, to confront deep-seated biases. With reputations, trust, and personal growth hanging in the balance, the journey becomes less about distance and more about bridging divides. The Sky Between Us is a gripping tale of fear, redemption, and the courage it takes to truly see someone else. Sometimes, the most transformative journeys happen within. The airport terminal buzzed with the hum of announcements and hurried passengers. Olivia Hayes walked purposefully toward her gate, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tiles. She clutched her leather briefcase with one hand and a lukewarm coffee in the other, her mind racing with the details of the case awaiting her in San Francisco. A win would salvage her reputation after the crushing defeat of her last case. A loss, well, she refused to entertain the thought. As Olivia approached the boarding line, she noticed a tall man ahead of her. His calm demeanor stood in contrast to the surrounding chaos. With closely cropped hair and a polished yet casual outfit, he seemed unbothered by the rush. He caught her gaze momentarily before turning back to the attendant checking boarding passes. Miles Carter adjusted the strap of his bag and smiled politely at the flight attendant before walking down the jet bridge. Olivia's eyes followed him, her stomach twisting inexplicably. Something about him feels off. She brushed the thought away, chalking it up to her exhaustion. Once inside the plane, Olivia was directed to her seat in business class, where she found herself directly across the aisle from the man. She glanced at his bag as he placed it in the overhead compartment, her brow furrowing. Miles settled into his seat and pulled out a well-worn paperback. He flipped to a page marked by a receipt and began reading, his lips moving slightly as he absorbed the text. Olivia tried to focus on the legal briefs on her tablet, but her eyes kept straying to him. He seemed too calm, too composed. Was that normal? Linda Wong, the flight attendant for their section, moved gracefully down the aisle, checking on passengers and offering warm smiles. She stopped briefly at Olivia's seat. "Would you like anything to drink before we take off?" Linda asked, her tone kind but professional. "No, I'm fine," Olivia replied curtly, her gaze still darting toward Miles. Linda followed Olivia's line of sight but saw nothing unusual, just a man reading quietly. Shrugging it off, she continued down the aisle. Miles, seemingly oblivious to Olivia's scrutiny, turned the page of his book. Olivia caught the title in bold print, The Art of Heart Surgery. A surgeon? She thought. Her mind, primed by years of watching the news, began piecing together a story that didn't sit right. Once the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Olivia leaned toward Linda as the flight attendant passed again. "Excuse me," Olivia began, lowering her voice, "but has anyone checked that man's bag thoroughly?" She nodded toward Miles. Linda blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Ma'am, security at the gate is very thorough. There's no reason to worry." "It's just, he's been acting strange," Olivia insisted. "You don't think it's odd? Sitting there, so quiet?" Linda offered a polite but firm smile. "I assure you, everything is fine. Please let me know if you need anything else." Olivia nodded, but the unease didn't fade. Across the aisle, Miles reached into his bag for a water bottle. He unscrewed the cap and took a measured sip, his movements unhurried. Olivia's breath caught. Later in the flight, Olivia leaned toward the woman seated behind her. "Do you see that man?" she whispered, gesturing subtly toward Miles. The woman, a middle-aged traveler engrossed in her own book, looked up briefly. "The one reading?" "Yes," Olivia pressed. Doesn't he seem suspicious to you? The woman frowned, shaking her head. He seems fine to me. Maybe you're overthinking it. Olivia leaned back, unconvinced. Her persistent glances and low murmurs hadn't gone unnoticed, though. Other passengers exchanged quiet looks, their curiosity piqued. Miles shifted slightly in his seat but didn't look up, his calm exterior unwavering. After the in-flight meal service, Olivia caught Linda's attention again. Listen, she began, her tone more insistent. I think you should check his bag. He's been reaching into it constantly. Linda sighed, keeping her voice even. Ma'am, we have protocols, and unless there's an immediate threat, we can't just search a passenger's belongings. I'm telling you, something isn't right, Olivia said, her voice rising slightly. A few heads turned in their direction. Miles finally glanced up, his eyes meeting Olivia's briefly. His calm, questioning expression only added fuel to her suspicions. She looked away quickly, her pulse quickening. Linda stepped back, mentally noting to update the captain on the growing tension. Miles, now fully aware of Olivia's hostility, took a deep breath and returned to his book, though the lines of tension in his jaw betrayed his growing discomfort. Linda Wong stepped into the rear galley, her usually calm features betraying a flicker of concern. The door clicked shut behind her, muffling the low hum of the cabin. Captain Harris stood nearby, arms crossed, his gaze steady but expectant. She's fixated on him, Linda said quietly, running a hand through her hair. I've tried to de-escalate, but Olivia won't let it go. Captain Harris nodded. Monitor the situation closely. Let's avoid any drastic measures unless absolutely necessary. No disruptions mid-air. Linda exhaled and nodded. Understood. She returned to the cabin, approaching Miles, who glanced up from his book with a raised brow. His calm demeanor seemed almost unshakable, but Linda noticed the subtle tension in his posture. Dr. Carter, she said softly. Everything all right? Miles smiled politely. Everything's fine. Just a tense atmosphere. Linda gave a small nod. If you need anything, let me know. I appreciate it, he replied, his voice measured. Linda moved on, but her eyes flicked toward Olivia, whose gaze remained locked on Miles like a hawk circling its prey. The hum of the engines was a steady background noise, a lullaby for most passengers. But Olivia Hayes couldn't relax. Every movement Miles made felt like a challenge, a silent dare. When he reached into his bag to retrieve something, she snapped. That's it. Olivia's voice cut through the cabin, sharp and loud. I want that bag searched. Heads whipped around. Conversations died mid-sentence. Linda hurried over, a calm but firm expression on her face. Ms. Hayes, please lower your voice, Linda said. Let's not alarm the other passengers. I'm not the one causing alarm, Olivia shot back, pointing at Miles. Him. He's the one acting suspicious. Miles slowly closed his book, placing it on the tray table. His eyes met Olivia's, calm but questioning. Suspicious how? He asked, his voice low and even. You've been fidgeting, checking that bag constantly, Olivia accused. What are you hiding? Passengers murmured, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Linda stepped between them, raising a hand. Ms. Hayes, Dr. Carter is a passenger like everyone else. Security checks were thorough before we boarded. Olivia crossed her arms, unmoved. You're making a mistake. Linda glanced at Miles, who shook his head slightly. It's fine, he said. I've got nothing to hide. Miles stood slowly, the controlled grace of a surgeon evident in every movement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification. I'm Dr. Miles Carter, he said, addressing not just Olivia but the entire cabin. Cardiac surgeon. I'm on my way to a medical conference. The suspicious items in my bag are medications I carry for emergencies, some of them life-saving. A silence settled over the cabin. The weight of Miles's words hung in the air, making Olivia's accusations feel hollow and absurd. Miles met Olivia's gaze again, softer this time. Please, he added, let's not make this flight harder for anyone. Linda nodded approvingly, stepping in to gently guide Olivia back to her seat. Thank you, Dr. Carter. As Olivia sat, fuming but silent, the passengers around her began whispering. Some nodded in Miles's direction, offering him apologetic smiles. Others glanced at Olivia with a mix of curiosity and judgment. He's right, a voice piped up from across the aisle. Leave the guy alone. She's just paranoid, someone else muttered. Olivia clenched her fists. The voices around her were knives, cutting deep into her sense of control. She felt isolated, exposed. And yet, a part of her still held firm, a stubborn refusal to admit she was wrong. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft glow. Passengers settled in for the night, eyes closing behind sleep masks or flickering over screens. Miles returned to his book, though his focus seemed elsewhere. Olivia stared out the window, her reflection a ghostly twin in the glass. The tension in her chest refused to dissipate. Her mind replayed every interaction, every glance, every word Miles had spoken. Why couldn't she let it go? Linda, passing by, gave her a sympathetic look. Try to get some rest, Ms. Hayes, she said gently. Olivia nodded but didn't respond. The quiet stretched, a fragile piece in the confined space. But both Olivia and Miles knew it was only a matter of time before the next storm hit. The cabin was eerily quiet. Passengers murmured softly, their voices lost beneath the steady hum of the engines. Olivia sat rigid, her gaze locked on Miles. Across the aisle, he shifted slightly, reaching into his bag. Her heart pounded. What was he doing now? Miles pulled out a small pill bottle, unscrewed the cap, and placed 2 tablets on his palm. He washed them down with a sip of water and leaned back in his seat, oblivious to Olivia's scrutiny. She leaned toward the passenger next to her, a middle-aged man engrossed in a crossword puzzle. Did you see that? She whispered urgently. He glanced up, eyebrows raised. See what? Him, Olivia hissed, jerking her head toward Miles. Taking something from his bag. Pills. What if they're not what they seem? The man gave her a bewildered look. Lady, they're pills. People take them all the time. He returned to his puzzle, shaking his head. Olivia's jaw clenched. This wasn't over. Olivia stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward Linda, who was busy organizing the drink cart. The flight attendant glanced up, a weary smile faltering as she saw Olivia's determined expression. Ms. Hayes, can I help you? Yes, Olivia said, her voice tight. You need to search that man's bag. Now. Linda straightened, her professional mask slipping just a little. We've been over this. I can't do that without cause. He just took something from it, Olivia insisted. You saw him. Linda sighed. He took medication, Ms. Hayes. That's not suspicious. But you don't know what kind of medication, Olivia pressed. What if it's dangerous? Linda's patience wore thin. We follow protocol for a reason. If there's an actual threat, we'll handle it. Right now, I need you to return to your seat. No, Olivia snapped. This is serious, and you're ignoring it. Passengers were watching now, heads turning, whispers spreading. The tension in the air thickened. Linda approached Miles, her expression apologetic but firm. Dr. Carter, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but could you help clarify things? Miles sighed, closing his book again. He pulled out his badge and held it up, the gold lettering catching the overhead light. I'm a cardiac surgeon, he said, his voice steady. The pills are blood pressure medication. Nothing more. The murmurs grew quieter. Olivia, however, remained standing, arms crossed. And we're just supposed to take your word for it. Miles met her gaze, unflinching. You could, yes. Or you could consider that not everything is a conspiracy. Linda retreated to the galley, where Captain Harris was waiting, arms folded. He'd heard enough. Is this going to be a problem? He asked. Linda shook her head. I'm handling it, but Ms. Hayes is persistent. Captain Harris's expression hardened. She needs to understand that if she causes another disturbance, she'll be restrained and met by security when we land. Make that clear. Linda nodded. I will. The plane dipped slightly, signaling the start of their descent. Olivia sat back in her seat, fuming silently. Across the aisle, Miles exhaled slowly, closing his eyes as if willing the tension away. Passengers shifted, adjusting seat belts and stowing away belongings. The mood was tense but quiet. Olivia's mind raced. She wasn't done, not yet. But for now, she'd wait. And Miles, sensing the storm brewing, braced himself for what was to come. The announcement came through the speakers, a calm voice reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The cabin lights flickered as the plane prepared for its final descent. Olivia Hayes, however, was far from calm. Her eyes darted toward Miles, who had leaned back in his seat with an air of quiet confidence. It infuriated her. She felt the tension in her chest tighten as if someone had pulled a string too taut. She couldn't let it go. Not yet. Pushing herself up from her seat, Olivia marched into the aisle, ignoring the flight attendant's instructions to sit down. All eyes turned toward her as she approached Miles's seat. You, she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention from every corner of the cabin. Open your bag. Miles, visibly exhausted, looked up at her. His brow furrowed in confusion. Excuse me. You heard me, Olivia snapped. You've been acting suspicious this entire flight, and I'm not going to sit back and let something happen. Ma'am, please return to your seat, Linda's voice cut through the tension. The flight attendant approached, her expression a mix of authority and concern. No, Olivia insisted, pointing at Miles. His bag. It needs to be searched. Linda placed a gentle but firm hand on Olivia's arm. Ms. Hayes, I need you to sit down. Now. The murmurs grew louder as passengers exchanged nervous glances. Captain Harris's voice broke through the commotion. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're handling the situation. Linda turned to Miles, her expression apologetic. I'm so sorry, Dr. Carter. This is highly irregular. Miles sighed, running a hand over his face. It's fine, he said quietly. I understand. Without waiting for further instructions, Miles unzipped his carry-on bag and pulled out the contents, a stethoscope, a journal, and a clear bag of prescription bottles. He held them up for everyone to see. Blood pressure medication, he explained calmly, though his voice carried a note of weariness. And a medical journal. Nothing more. Olivia's face reddened, but she refused to back down. That doesn't prove anything, she muttered. Captain Harris stepped into the cabin, his presence commanding immediate attention. Ms. Hayes, he said, his tone clipped. Return to your seat, or I will have you restrained. For a moment, Olivia hesitated. Then, under the weight of countless stares and the captain's unwavering gaze, she sat down. The plane began its descent, the city lights of Los Angeles twinkling below. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a heavy silence punctuated only by the hum of the engines. Miles closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The weight of the confrontation pressed against him, but he refused to let it break his composure. Olivia, on the other hand, felt a storm brewing inside her. She stared out the window, her reflection a ghostly figure against the night sky. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. Olivia remained seated, her mind racing. When the seatbelt sign turned off, 2 uniformed officers entered the cabin. Linda gestured toward Olivia, and they approached her seat. "Ms. Hayes," one of them said. "We need you to come with us." Olivia's face drained of color. "What?" "No, this is a mistake." "It's protocol," the officer replied. "Please." With no choice, Olivia stood and allowed herself to be escorted off the plane. The walk down the aisle felt like a gauntlet, the eyes of every passenger burning into her. Miles watched her go but said nothing. In the terminal, Miles was greeted by a colleague who enveloped him in a warm hug. "How was the flight?" they asked. Miles glanced back toward the gate, where Olivia stood surrounded by officers. He shook his head. "Eventful." The colleague smiled sympathetically. "Come on. We've got a lot to prepare for tomorrow." As they walked away, Olivia watched from afar, a deep sense of shame settling in her chest. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, not just the embarrassment but the realization of what they revealed about herself. And for the first time, Olivia Hayes began to wonder if she could change. The conference room was a simple but elegant space, with sunlight streaming through half-drawn blinds. Miles sat across from his attorney, Jennifer Brooks, who wore a navy blazer and an air of quiet confidence. Between them lay the final stack of documents transferring ownership of his clinic. "It's all finalized, Dr. Carter," Jennifer said, sliding a pen toward him. "The clinic officially belongs to the new management team." Miles exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers as if they held the weight of a lifetime. "I thought this moment would feel different," he admitted. "More like closure." Jennifer tilted her head. "You've done something incredible here. This clinic has been a lifeline for so many. And now, it's in capable hands." Miles nodded but hesitated before picking up the pen. His thoughts drifted to his younger brother, Jordan. A sharp pang of grief tightened his chest. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "when I started this clinic, it wasn't just about offering care. It was about giving people what Jordan never had, a fighting chance. If he'd had that, he might still be here." Jennifer's expression softened. "You've honored him in the best way possible, Miles. And what you've built will outlive us all." After a long pause, Miles signed the papers. As he set the pen down, he whispered, more to himself than to Jennifer, "I just hope it's enough." The hotel room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. Olivia sat cross-legged on the bed, her laptop open on the desk nearby. On the screen, the phrase, "unconscious bias, understanding its impact," stared back at her from an article she had been rereading for the past hour. Her thoughts kept circling back to the flight. The humiliation burned anew each time she recalled Miles's calm demeanor as he revealed his credentials. His quiet dignity had stood in stark contrast to her panicked accusations. She reached for the hotel-provided notepad on the nightstand and began scribbling a list. Miles Carter, apology owed. Why did I assume the worst? Fix personal blind spots. She tapped her pen against the paper, frustration bubbling up. What is wrong with me? She muttered aloud. Her phone buzzed on the bed. It was an email from HR at her firm, titled Mandatory Training on Diversity and Inclusion. She groaned, rubbing her temples. Clearly, the fallout from the flight had already reached her professional life. Her gaze fell on the notepad again. The first item glared at her, apology owed. But how did you apologize to someone whose trust you'd shattered? The cafe near the airport was buzzing with life, the smell of freshly ground coffee mingling with the chatter of travelers. Olivia sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of chamomile tea. She was exhausted, mentally and emotionally, but the bustling environment offered a small comfort. As she glanced toward the counter, she froze. There he was, Miles Carter, calm and composed as he ordered a coffee. She felt her heart race, her throat tightening. What were the odds they'd end up in the same place? She considered approaching him. Her mind raced through potential opening lines. "I'm sorry for what happened. I was wrong." But each one felt insufficient. Before she could decide, Miles turned, his coffee in hand. Their eyes met briefly. He paused, offering her a polite nod before walking toward the exit. "Wait," she almost said aloud, but her voice failed her. She watched as he disappeared through the door, leaving her with a mix of relief and regret. The glass doors of Hayes and Associates gleamed in the morning light as Olivia walked into the office. The usual energy of the place felt different, quieter, heavier. She noticed the way her colleagues avoided her gaze or exchanged quick whispers as she passed by. When she reached her office, there was a printed memo waiting on her desk. Subject: Incident on Flight 328. While no formal action is being taken, we recommend you attend a series of diversity and inclusion workshops to ensure alignment with the firm's values. Please confirm your availability with HR. Olivia sank into her chair, staring at the memo. She had spent years building a reputation as a sharp, capable attorney. Now, that image felt fragile, her credibility tainted by a single, public lapse in judgment. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Daniel, one of her senior colleagues. "Hey," he said, stepping inside. His tone was careful, measured. "I heard about, well, everything. Are you okay?" Olivia managed a weak smile. "I'll survive." Daniel hesitated. "You know, we've all made mistakes. What matters is how you move forward." His words were meant to reassure, but they landed like a challenge. How could she move forward when she barely understood how she had ended up here? The box of books had been sitting in Olivia's apartment for months, untouched. Tonight, she finally opened it. Inside were titles she had ordered during a fleeting interest in self-improvement: Dare to Lead, Emotional Agility, and Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. She picked up the last one, flipping through the pages until she landed on a chapter about implicit bias in decision-making. The words cut deep. Biases are not inherently malicious, they are byproducts of the brain's need to categorize. The harm lies in leaving them unexamined. Olivia read the sentence again, then closed the book and stared at the ceiling. For years, she had prided herself on being logical, rational. Yet, on that flight, her logic had been skewed by fear, her reason by assumption. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her sister, Lauren. "Hey, thinking of you. Want to talk?" A lump rose in Olivia's throat. She hadn't spoken to Lauren in months, not since their last argument about Olivia missing another family event. She typed back, "I'd like that." As the night wore on, Olivia found herself revisiting the idea of writing to Miles. She opened her laptop, the cursor blinking on a blank email. Slowly, she began to type. "Dr. Carter, I owe you an apology." The clinic hummed with quiet activity as Miles stood in the reception area, flanked by his team. The walls were freshly painted, a warm yellow that reflected the optimism he hoped to leave behind. A banner read, "Welcome to your new beginning." Beside him, a young doctor adjusted his white coat nervously. "It's an honor, Dr. Carter," he said, shaking Miles's hand. "I hope I can do justice to what you've built here." "You'll do more than justice," Miles replied, his tone steady. "This clinic isn't just about medicine. It's about trust, community, and resilience. You'll have their backs the way they need it." The new team leader nodded, his admiration clear. As the staff applauded, Miles's gaze drifted to a photograph on the wall, a candid shot of him and Jordan, his brother, taken at the clinic's opening years ago. His throat tightened, but he managed a small smile. "Jordan, we did it," he whispered under his breath, his voice carried away by the applause. The hum of Olivia's office was broken only by the tapping of her fingers on her keyboard. The words on the screen blurred as she hesitated, rereading the email she had drafted for the third time. Dr. Carter, I owe you an apology. My actions were inexcusable, driven by assumptions I had no right to make. I hope you'll allow me the chance to explain myself in person. I deeply regret the harm I caused you. Her hand hovered over the send button. Every part of her screamed that this wasn't enough, that no email could capture the complexity of her remorse or undo the harm she'd caused. She sighed, saving the draft and closing her laptop. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant peeked in. Ms. Hayes, there's an event invitation here for you. It's from the Carter Foundation. Olivia's brow furrowed as she accepted the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to a charity gala celebrating the transfer of the clinic Miles had founded. She stared at it, her heart pounding. Maybe this was the opportunity she needed. Olivia sat in the back row of a mentoring session hosted by her firm, a notebook balanced on her lap. The panelists were discussing diversity in leadership, but the words struck a deeper chord than she'd expected. A middle-aged speaker with a warm yet commanding presence said, "Acknowledging bias isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility. It's about saying, I'm part of this system, and I can do better." Olivia scribbled furiously, her mind replaying every interaction she'd had with Miles. At the end of the session, she approached the speaker. "Thank you for your insight," Olivia began. "I've been trying to understand how to start making amends for a mistake I made." The speaker's smile was kind but firm. "Start by listening more than you speak. And when you do speak, let it come from a place of genuine humility. People can tell the difference." Olivia nodded, the advice sinking in. She had a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt capable of taking the first step. The gala was held in an elegant ballroom, its high ceilings adorned with soft lights that cast a warm glow over the attendees. Olivia entered cautiously, clutching her invitation like a lifeline. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Miles near the stage, speaking with a small group of colleagues. Her stomach churned. Every instinct told her to leave, but she forced herself to stay. This wasn't about comfort, it was about accountability. "Olivia Hayes?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a middle-aged woman in a sleek gown. "Yes." Olivia replied hesitantly. "I'm Rachel, one of the board members for the Carter Foundation. Miles mentioned you might be here." "He's over there," she said, gesturing toward the stage. "He'll want to see you." Olivia swallowed hard. "Thank you. I'll find him." Miles stood by the stage, sipping water as Olivia approached. She hesitated, her heart hammering. When he noticed her, his expression was unreadable, but he didn't turn away. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure if I should come." "I didn't personally invite you," he replied, his tone neutral. "But I'm not surprised you're here." She winced but pressed on. "I need to apologize. What I did on that flight, what I assumed, it was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry." Miles studied her for a moment, his silence heavy. Then he said, "What are you sorry for, Ms. Hayes? For embarrassing me? For being seen doing it? Or for the biases that led you there?" His words cut deep, but Olivia nodded. "All of it. I've spent weeks reflecting on how I got to that place, why I let fear control me. It's no excuse, but I'm trying to be better." Miles's expression softened slightly. "Trying is a start. But what matters is what you do with that effort. It's not me you owe, it's the next person who might face your assumptions." Olivia felt tears prick her eyes but held them back. "Thank you for your honesty. I won't forget this." Miles nodded, offering a faint smile. "Good luck, Olivia." As he turned to rejoin his colleagues, Olivia felt the weight of his forgiveness, not as absolution, but as a challenge to do better.